Join me as I share my craziest survival story in the Himalayas and reveal the chilling encounter that left me questioning everything. A guy embarked on a week-long trek into the Himalayas in December 1991, but the guy was still nowhere to be found at the end of the week, and what lay ahead for him was one of the longest and most painful trials the region had ever seen. You should use caution when watching this terrifying tale, since it is his story. James Scott, a medical student from Australia, took some time in September 1990 to compose a correspondence. Upon completion, he neatly folded the document, placed it inside an envelope, and then sealed it before leaving it at the post office. Among the world's least developed nations at the time, the South Asian nation of Nepal was the odd recipient of the letter. But James saw the country's dire situation as an ideal opportunity to serve as an elective before graduating from medical school and helping people in need. James sent the letter to a hospital in Kathmandu and waited impatiently for a response, but he never received anything. Over the course of many days, weeks, and months, he received no response, which rather saddened him. However, James refuses to accept defeat gracefully, so he had enlisted the help of his close buddy Tim Hooper and had an airline ticket to Nepal in his possession after a whole year. In his pursuit of a medical degree, he hoped to persuade a local hospital to temporarily employ him. Fortunately, it worked out so he could just show up there without bothering anybody about a seat. He received a response, an emphatic yes, right before his flight to Nepal. At the tail end of December 1991, the hospital told him he may start his elective period. The cherry on top for the 22-year-old was receiving this long-awaited response. Attending an excellent medical school and achieving stellar marks made James feel like he was living it up. He had also met the lady he intended to marry upon his return to Australia after his residency in Nepal. He was looking forward to the experience that lay ahead in South Asia, even if it meant temporarily leaving his family and fiancé in Australia. Everything was falling into place for him. James wasn't the kind to seek out extreme activities, but he did love keeping himself busy. Hiking, or bushwalking as it is commonly known in Australia, was his form of exercise, and he would do it as often as 6 times weekly. He was also an accomplished cyclist who rode through some of the most difficult landscapes in his own country. But karate was his true calling. With his black belt in hand and a national competition under his belt, James won the Queensland Championships in 1989 and placed 3rd in the Australian Championships the same year. The point is that James could have taken care of himself since he was young, healthy, powerful, and fit. Even though James's residency doesn't start until December, he and Tim traveled to Nepal in September to begin settling in. He made more trips to the hospital after that, during which he met the medical staff he would soon be working with, and they came to know him as well. And when they found out how much he loved being active, they suggested that he start trekking the neighboring Himalayas during his free time before his elective period. This was a once-in-a-lifetime chance for James, an extreme hiker. The Himalayas aren't your average mountain range. In fact, being one of the towns most directly next to Mount Everest makes Kathmandu seem like the center of the universe. James liked to go trekking, although he wasn't very good at climbing. Actually, he had an extreme fear of heights, so attempting to climb Everest was out of the question. Fortunately, however, the Himalayas provide a diverse range of terrain that was far better suited to his abilities. Right after James and Tim were situated in Kathmandu, they began making plans to go up the Jomsom Trail. This popular hiking path passes through forests, rugged terrain, and the world's deepest canyons. It takes almost a week to finish. Since this wasn't going to be a casual day trek, James and Tim wanted to be well prepared. In preparation for the impending Himalayan winter, they made a list of everything they would need and decided to employ 2 porters and a guide to assist them with the heavy lifting. James and Tim had a great time on the hike until the time came to go. During their ascent, they were able to take in some of the most breathtaking vistas on the planet, reaching altitudes of 9,800 feet, 3,000 meters. Even though they were bracing for very cold weather, the high elevations made it seem much more bearable. Along the way, they even saw other hikers who were clad in little more than ski coats and shoes. James and Tim quickly began to feel a twinge of embarrassment about their over-preparation. They decided to leave most of their stuff in Kathmandu with the guide and porters after just a few days of hiking, leaving them to carry only what they could fit in their packs. After a few days of riding the high of finishing the Himalayan journey, they returned to Kathmandu. Since the trip was a success, they wasted no time in organizing a second one to fit in before James began his elective rotation at the Kathmandu Hospital. They reasoned that they would be better prepared for the Himalayas after experiencing a taste of them. The catch was that their subsequent journey wouldn't start until late December, which was quite different from a September in the Himalayas. They should have been better prepared for their next scheduled walk after finishing the Jamsam Trail with such ease, but they were naive to think so. The Hlambu Trail was going to be their path this time. It was more difficult, but there were lodges along the way where they could stop and eat. In December, when they were down to their last packing details, they had brought along as little stuff as could fit in their rucksacks. In addition, James carried 10 sets of underwear, a few t-shirts, 1 pair of thermal underwear, slacks, a sweater, and a lightweight jacket. For the evenings spent in the lodges, he also carried along a single towel, his camera, and no less than 4 novels. After setting out on the journey on December 21st, they reached the first lodge on the Hlambu Trail and saw several German hikers making their way back. The Germans assured James and Tim that the hike wasn't too strenuous, but that there wasn't much to see either, so they began to doubt their original intention. James then retrieved an old, out-of-date map of Nepal from his collection. This was typical of maps from third world nations, but it did allow him to make out some other trails in case they chose to deviate from their original plan. The Germans removed a newer and superior map and let James and Tim retain it after examining the one James was examining. The two continued their journey by aiming for the Go Sankun Trail, a branch of the Hlambu Trail that had been omitted from the previous map. Thus, they rose early the next day, and while traveling, they met a guy called Mark Fulton, who was hiking alone. As fate would have it, Mark had an Australian accent, which James and Tim picked up on right away, leading to the trio's rapid camaraderie. In fact, Mark had also intended to follow the Hlambu Trail, but after hearing stories from the German hikers, James and Tim wasted no time in dissuading him off the path. Everything was resolved when one of them proposed hiking the Go Sankun Trail together. After that, the trio continued on the Hlambu Trail in search of the fork that would take them to their other path. Despite Tim's best efforts, he was unable to continue due to a leg injury he sustained along the route. Tim intervened and informed them that he was about to travel back to Kathmandu. Tim adamantly wanted James to accompany Mark and complete the walk, but James only agreed to return with him after a brief discussion with Tim. The will to continue was evident on James's expression, even if Tim didn't express it directly. As a result, the two friends decided to have dinner at their favorite restaurant on Christmas Eve before parting ways. During this time, Tim requested one of the maps from James that he might use. However, James was momentarily distracted and offered Tim the new map that the Germans had given him, the one with Go Sankun instead. Additionally, Tim failed to relinquish the one lighter they had, which James and Mark could want for future fire-starting purposes. Regardless, James and Mark spent the remainder of the day trekking into the Himalayas, eventually setting up camp at an elevation of around 9,800 feet. They reached the place known as Therapati the next day, which was where Go Sankun was intersected. When they got there, they saw a number of hikers making their way back down Go Sankun in their direction. They paused for a little conversation so that James and Mark could have a better idea of what was ahead. Even though the terrain was difficult, the returning hikers stated that it was much simpler to navigate since there was no snow. When James and Mark were sure they had made the correct choice, they thanked the hikers and proceeded on to the next lodge. The next morning, when the sun rose, the two guys were taken aback. A little coating of snow fell overnight, but the clouds were causing anxiety. They wanted to be sure, so they contacted the lodge keeper and inquired about the likelihood of snowfall that day. The lodge keeper assured them that crossing the pass would not be an issue since snow was not predicted. James and Mark left the lodge at 7:30 in the morning and hiked for an hour and a half along a perfect track, admiring the stunning mountain scenery. However, things changed quickly as the morning progressed. Dark clouds continued to move in, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Also, snow began to fall shortly after, albeit it paled in comparison to what had likely fallen overnight. Rather than that, what they saw were huge flakes that obscured their vision and began to pile up under their feet at a quicker rate than either of them had anticipated. The once visible track was soon covered in 5 inches of snow after the storm had plowed the ground. As a result, James started to worry that they should turn around and go back as they proceeded on. Just as he was about to speak, however, he and Mark found themselves in a situation where they couldn't see each other, on opposite sides of a stream. James quickly expressed his concerns to Mark about the circumstances, and they would have to yell back and forth for 15 minutes before they could reconnect. On the other hand, Mark didn't seem to care, and was certain that he could find a way to return to Kathmandu. Uncertainty set in for James, who let Mark down by deciding that returning to the lodge they had stayed at the night before would be the wisest course of action. They had a short chat before they parted ways. Mark, however, had already resolved to keep on. While James made every effort to follow the footsteps as he set out on his return trip, the heavy snowfall meant that they were becoming more obscured as he continued. Not long after that, he became completely disoriented. With the snow falling so heavily, it was hard to see more than 30 feet ahead, and there weren't many, if any, markers to indicate the route. James had to accept the reality that he had been disoriented as a result of this. Then, he set out to follow the adjacent stream in the hopes of reaching a settlement. After consulting an ancient map, he discovered that the creek led directly to Talu. The valley he had been in had shrunk dramatically, and the towering rock faces were quickly encroaching on him as he continued to trek for another 4 hours. He proceeded along after seeing, in his limited field of vision, that many streams joined to create a little river. The river had dried up entirely after a short while of walking. However, since the rock walls that had been further away were now closer than they had ever been before, it was a cascade of water. James cautiously approached the edge and peered down, determined to discover a way down it, and he realized it was going to be a bad situation right away. With his height estimate at around 100 feet, 30 meters, he found himself abruptly bereft of options. Descending was not an option, and returning was just as uncertain. As a result, climbing became the last remaining choice. Even though James wasn't very good at climbing, he thought that if he could reach a high enough point, he would be able to avoid the storm by waiting above the clouds. After estimating that the rock face was around the same height as the waterfall, James spent the next 2 hours clambering up and down precarious ledges until he reached the peak. On some occasions, he barely managed to keep his grip. Upon completing the task, he ascended the cliff and promptly passed out from fatigue. Despite the inherent risk of the climb, James managed to locate a rocky overhang that provided him with a temporary refuge at the cliff's peak. As he regained his strength, he thought back on his medical school days and how serious a disease hypothermia is. Although it may seem backwards, he undressed thoroughly before settling beneath the overhang, using his towel to dry every inch of his body. After being wet and freezing for hours, he decided it was better to be cold and dry instead. His clothing was drenched. Under this rocky ledge, he set up camp that night after finishing, pulling his sleeping bag over his head. James, in a last-ditch effort to escape his predicament, set out early in the morning. He then found another brook and began to follow it, but progress was painfully slow due to the heavy snow. He had only covered 1 kilometer after 2 hours of walking. The gully's sides were exceedingly slippery with snow and ice, but not quite as high as the ones he had experienced the day before. So, whenever he thought climbing would be a good idea, he would only be able to go so far before tumbling back down to the gully bottom. Thankfully, he discovered another overhang to set up a tent behind by 4 p.m., when he had had enough. Reminding himself of his previous experience, he undressed to the best of his ability and discovered that his feet were entirely numb. Afterwards, he changed into dry clothes and went to bed, shivering even more than the night before. Actually, he thought he wouldn't survive the night for a while there. He went so far as to get a notepad and pen from his bag and begin penning a message to his loved ones. He was so sorry for the pain this would give them, and the guilt he felt for putting himself in this predicament was overwhelming. After finishing the letter, he put his notepad aside and lay down again to wait for it to end. A call came into James's elder sister, Joanne Robertson's Brisbane house on December 29th, which is 5 days after their scheduled dinner meeting in Kathmandu. Shortly after her husband took the call, he made his way downstairs to have a conversation with her. Tim had notified James's parents of his disappearance by fax. Joanne was visibly shaken by the news and immediately began to freak out since she had no idea what to do next. Her first instinct was to board an aircraft as soon as possible from Nepal. However, the Australian Foreign Affairs Department had already learned of James's disappearance and advised Joanne to remain put. To find her brother, they suggested contacting Carl Harrison, a climber based in Kathmandu, who might spearhead the hunt. After a day of nervous waiting, James's family finally saw Carl and the first search group leave. They patiently awaited the phone call that would inform them that James had been snowed in at one of the lodges along the way. But the days went by without any call. On January 2nd, 1992, After Joanne had repeatedly contacted the Foreign Affairs Department for updates, she finally received a response. They informed her that several French-Canadian hikers had reported seeing a lone hiker, and that the search group had a 99% certainty that it was James. Joanne felt a great sense of relief and contacted her parents to share the good news, but she couldn't stand to stay around and wait for answers any longer. On January 7th, she took a trip to South Asia after getting a Nepal travel visa the day before. It had been 16 days since James went missing when she reached Kathmandu. James attempted to journey out of the Himalayas many times, but each time the weight of the snow or the severity of the storms forced him back to his solitary rock ledge. He had to eat snow to stay alive, as he had only packed 2 chocolate bars and they were long since eaten. It soon became obvious that he wouldn't be able to escape by walking out. Finally, he realized that being found by a helicopter or waiting for the snow to melt sufficiently in the spring, months away, were his best bets for surviving the experience. After that, he made the rocky ledge his permanent home. The only things he could do, sleep and read, because he was hungry, cold, and had nothing to wear except his sleeping bag and the clothing on his back. However, it was clear that nothing could quench the insatiable desire he was experiencing. After the first 2 weeks or so of subsisting only on snow, the hunger subsided as he relied on the self-control he had developed as a karate student. Thoughts of food consumed him both during the day and in his dreams. He would focus intently on certain motions, methods, and sequences, as if meditating, losing himself in every nuance. Before long, his foot problems were the only thing that could interrupt his line of thinking. His inability to feel them persisted for a while, and his attempts to warm them up were fruitless. Eventually, he took off his shoes and socks to reveal a shocking shade of blue on his feet. Going on to the medical kit, he retrieved a set of dissection scissors. After that, he stabbed them into the side of his foot. James had zero discomfort as the incision flowed rapidly. He was now paralyzed with fear that he may lose his footing, even if he managed to survive the event. As if that weren't bad enough, he was abruptly informed one day that he was not the highest-ranking mountain dweller. Terrifying cries from animals startled James one day. After ripping the sleeping bag off his head, he sprang to his feet and peered over the sloping granite ledge that towered above him. He saw a trembling shrub 30 meters, 100 feet away, but he couldn't tell what was causing it until a huge dark figure entered the area. A black bear native to the Himalayas has set its eyes on James. As James yelled for the bear to come down the hill to him, he seized the dissection scissors and gripped them firmly. In this moment of madness, James's sole thought was that the bear could put an end to him quickly. However, the bear became scared and quickly ran up the hill, disappearing from view rather than approaching him. Regardless, he listened for the bear's approach to his overhang over the next 5 nights, bracing himself for an assault. At the same time as James was struggling for his life, the rescue mission was encountering several obstacles. Numerous rescue groups attempted to cross the Himalayas, but were either forced to turn back due to inclement weather, difficult terrain, or even loss in the mountains themselves. Joanne was now in Nepal and much closer to her brother's whereabouts, but she felt powerless to do anything except do what she could. The French-Canadian hikers she tracked down claimed to have seen James. Upon meeting with her, the majority of the group was sure it was her brother they had seen, but one of the females there wasn't quite convinced. In the days leading up to the sighting, she had conversed with a lone German trekker, and she believed she identified him as the guy who had been mistaken for James. As expected, search committee members received a letter from a German guy claiming to be a lone hiker on the Hlambu trail. The prospect that her brother could be alive someplace was almost dashed for Joanne by this. James had been missing for 21 days at that point, and Joanne's desperation was reaching breaking point. Out of nowhere, a local lady she had spoken to at the Kathmandu airport came flooding back to her mind. Joanne sought her advice after the 2 ladies discussed James's predicament. The local lady responded by stating her intention to seek the advice of a Buddhist Lama. The local lady reassured Joanne that Lamas could see things that others couldn't, which seemed like a strange statement to an Australian. Joanne hadn't given the local woman's idea much thought up until that point, but since things were becoming worse, she decided it couldn't harm to follow her advice. Joanne arranged a meeting with a Buddhist Lama, briefed him on the issue, and showed him a map of the area where James was thought to be missing. After listening to Joanne explain everything, the Lama meditated about it for a while before glancing at the map. After that, he pointed to a triangle including the cities of Fadi, Gopte, and Talu, and instructed her to send searchers there. It was quite improbable that James would wind up in the region the llama indicated. One reason was that the llama was certain that they would locate James at this location, even though mountain experts were skeptical that there was a way to get there. The llama assured her that she would see her brother again when she inquired if they would locate James alive before she departed. Meanwhile, the search's more pragmatic strategy, which included locating Mark, was presumably still in progress. Even after all this time, rescuers still hadn't located him, and it was feared that he would be lost in the mountains. It was learned via Tim that Mark was supposed to return to Australia before January 21st, and that he had a trip to Thailand following Christmas. Mark received a communication at the airport from the Australian embassy, and he contacted Joanne on January 15th. Mark had escaped the Himalayas by tracing a different route, which brought him to a nearby settlement. A shocking discovery was conveyed to her by him when he said that he and James had parted halfway between Fadi and Gopte. Because of this, James was no longer being sought for by rescuers. He had redirected his attention to the southwest. He would find himself smack dab in the center of the triangle the llama had shown on the chart if he persisted along that route. James was ultimately rescued after 30 days in the Himalayas when he heard the faintest sounds of an effort to locate him. As it got closer, he realized it was a helicopter, although he had first thought it was the wind. A definite chopping sound had entered the distance. Then he sprang out of his sack, snatched it, and limped into an opening. In an effort to be more visible, he removed his trousers to expose his bright red long johns and tossed the sleeping bag over his head. He saw the helicopter circle for a few seconds until it turned back and faded into the distance. He guessed that it was around 6 miles, or 10 kilometers distant. To that point in his tenure in the Himalayas, this was among the most discouraging events. James had shrunk to the point that his once muscular physique was nothing more than a skeletal frame. In addition to feeling weak and sick, he had a terrible throat infection and ulcers in his mouth. Overall, he was utterly sad and despondent. At this point, he contemplated suicide on a serious level. The thought that his corpse would be discovered and his loved ones would hear of his agony and death was the only thing that prevented him from carrying it out. So James tried to keep going, even though his chances of survival or rescue were quite low. Once again, he heard the sound of a helicopter creeping near him on his 42nd day in the Himalayas. He pulled himself out of his sleeping bag and waved it in the air again, using all the effort he had left. James waved till he passed out in the snow from tiredness after the chopper circled him for 20 minutes. In a matter of moments, the helicopter swooped down the valley and vanished. Now James was aware that he was being watched, but he also knew that they would have to walk up to him for at least 4 days. His life had already been taken at that point. At the rescue headquarters, Joanne continued her daily routine of sitting by the radio, eagerly awaiting any updates from the mountain searchers. At that moment, there was a crackling sound on the radio, and a voice said that they had located James and that he was alive. Because this was such a remote possibility, the rescuer felt it necessary to repeat the message twice before anybody would believe it. It was at that same time that Joanne was unable to react to the message. She was completely overwhelmed. Carl and a group of rescuers got on foot once the chopper came back at some point. James reclined in a sleeping bag under the rock ledge above the mountain valleys, listening to the same sounds of wind and solitude he had heard for almost 40 days. As if someone were speaking distantly, a third sound suddenly cut through the first two. James felt this was the end. He was getting dangerously close to hypothermia, which was causing him hallucinations and the certainty that his death was imminent. Then, however, the sound of voices became louder. James then took a long breath to calm himself, before whistling loudly through his teeth, completely unprepared for any reaction. After that, one of them wanted to know whether he was Australian James Scott, and James confirmed. He was embraced and kissed as the two guys leaped under the awning. His recovery had been their first priority, so their excitement was palpable. After that, one of them gazed up at James and declared him to be divine. "No one has ever lived in this section of the Himalayas for more than 10 days, the Savior said to James when James inquired why he stated so. But James had made it through 43. James was hoisted into the helicopter the next morning after being fastened to a harness. At the landing pad, Joanne waited expectantly for her brother to arrive. As soon as the helicopter touched down, a number of rescuers rushed out to assist James. Joanne bolted over to him, and he began to move toward her. They hugged for what seemed like an eternity. As they escorted James to the hospital, she hardly recognized him. He was dangerously underweight, filthy, and bearded. This would be his final stroll for quite a while. However, he would ultimately recover completely. It was precisely at this location that the Lama had predicted that James would be located.